The Crooked Epic. 1. Inn. 1. The Inn of Maniacal Madness. 3. Ted. The Lake. 3C. 2. A half mile from the bridge, the dirt road began a slow decline, and they naturally picked up their pace. The woods started thinning out as they headed away from the river, which meandered and babbled beside them for a while to the left until it disappeared out into the dark. The dirt beneath them transitioned to gravel, and after another 100 feet there was a sharp dip in the downward angle. The road also changed compositions from stones to elaborate brick, and they were caught off guard by the change in scenery as massive forests dissipated in relief around them and were replaced with fields of short grass and distant tree lines on either side. An open sky returned above them, from behind encompassing branches which had blanketed the night. Incredible stars glowed brighter than ever seen before, like each was under an observatory telescopic magnification doubling its size. As they walked the next 200 feet down the left side of the sharply descending road, their eyes began exploring the fluorescence below, which rose to the line of sight. While nearing a small town below, they observed shining lights inside houses and around buildings. The city light became a beacon, and the wind and the sails of a reassumed familiarity with civilization signals of welcome from the wilderness. Atop each step toward the first row of buildings, they saw through the shaded reflections, glowing refractions, and shadows of lamps along streets, torches around corners, lanterns atop stoops, and window panes filled with shining bulbs, chandeliers, and candles against the brick, stone bridge and walls. They were blinking and waving to their voyage's backdrop in motives of extorted fear. It grew impatient and shrunk against the hill, forest, rivers, and wildlife, convalescing into the incandescence of human dwellings, and gatherings of people brought hope for rest and food. Besides the inevitable fact of how they had been presently chased by unnatural offenders twice consecutively, the necessities for survival were becoming far too real to ignore. The boys had not eaten since breakfast and had only an empty canteen and no food, and freshly penetrating delirium of nearly psychotic insomnia, which was created in waves upon entering the other world they had found together. Clothes that were damp from the rainstorm were still barely drying, and their pants were drenched from running through the lake. Eventually, the brick road became cobblestone as it entered the village. Along the preliminary buildings was a fence, and the road went between them under an arch over the gate opening. Beyond the first buildings, there were more than 5 continuous initial blocks until the road separated in a V at the center of the town, at which point the buildings grew larger. Small markets and shops stretched to each side of the 2 buildings next to the arch. On the right side, to their east, another block of buildings was banded to a concrete wall, which began after the markets, and afterward was a large park. The park was big and wide, so the 2 brothers could not see the other side of it in the dark. There was a similar block of buildings on the western side, although not as wide, and a boardwalk around a very small lake. The lake had a gazebo on a bridge which was barely visible from the arch, and the boys saw a small pier on the shoreline which reached nearest to the forest. It seemed to be fed into by the river behind them, and it too was bordered by a high, barbed wire and double-fenced wall. Also, far on the end of the lake between the bridge and river, a towering shape rose into immense shadows, silhouetted across the celestially speckled sky. So, they walked up the partitioned cement on the left under the iron arch, around the red wooden fence toward the splitting streets. The tall buildings on both the left and right had doors facing the roads from the outer walls, creating a short hall to the wooden doorway. Each side of the galleries had windows, and after the entranceways, more oversized windows were facing the street. Both had the letters SSO printed onto the window panes. Within the O of the lettering, A symbol looked like a numeric 4 or capital Y, with an extra embellishment under the bottom descenders which resembled a hook facing the left sides of the special characters. In the windows of both buildings were lights, and a man was sitting and reading a newspaper in the building to the left. Seeing the first sign of another human was monumental for them, and they both skeptically inspected him, stopping their walk short at 10 feet up the sidewalk from the window, presumably in the more shadowy area where his attention would not be caught. He was an older man who seemed to be a receptionist or secretary for the building, and he wore glasses and a white-collared shirt which was buttoned up but without a tie. "Teddy, I think those are military posts or militias, and not American," Alex whispered, covering his mouth with his hand and leaning up to Ted's left ear. The man inside was white-skinned, but Ted sensed how he is not an officer of peace, law, or wayward soldier to any American armed services. There was no flag nor symbol of any kind, which made him seem more suspicious, but behind him was a wall where there were filing cabinets, cubbies, drawers, and a few bookshelves, underneath a series of signs which read foreign languages on them. The security seemed organized and tightly planned, with intricately designed architectures from which to survey the town. Whomever the people there were, they looked ready despite the young boy's infiltration oversight. The magnitude of such discovery was conspiratorial in the premise, yet it seemed too doubtful of a chance for the father to be able to hide cooperation with any nation other than the United States, or to keep this big of a secret from his superior command or his family. Across the road, the other building was similar inside. The effaced wall in the back had blackboards with erased chalk writing on them. Slightly fewer drawers and bookshelves than the one to the left, and the language was all foreign. There was nobody inside, but there was a door which was ajar against the right side of the wall. The man sitting to the left now turned the page of his newspaper and looked up. They crouched lower as he paused for a moment, waiting to decide on the next move. As he stood up and spun around from the seat, Alex took Ted's hand and led him closer to the wall underneath the front window past the entranceway. They were going to sneak around the window, but Ted was not sure why. Rather than ask, Ted followed his brother's directives, preparing to make a run back past the gate if they were spotted. Then they passed the windows into a farther darkened corner between the next building and this one. As quiet as they could creep around the light shining from the windows, the night around them was more peaceful still. There was no music nor noise in the air from people or vehicles, wildlife or radios. Inside, the man leaned against a drawer while looking at one of the bookshelves. The scene made them wonder if the town they had stumbled into was without technology, or if it was one of those religious communities they had heard of where there were restrictions on industry, entertainment, and socializing. The only thing that made them consider otherwise was the lighting along the streets. Whenever the brothers looked up higher, they could see telephone wires attached to many of the buildings and even antenna dishes on the roofs of the two buildings they were passing, which may have been used to attract radio signals. The door across the street in the entranceway swung open, creaking and moaning as it slid out from the hinges. A man with a military uniform came out with a rifle slung over his back. His boots clicked on the cement and echoed. Luckily, Alex and Ted were only a few feet from the end of the building, past the big glass window and light. Before the soldier had fully exited and onto the sidewalk, they managed to get around the corner into an alleyway between this building and the next. They deliberated the route while waiting in silence, even though they were tired and hungry. They eyed the man's actions with scrutinous patience while being as inconspicuous as possible. Evading the stranger's detection until he was soon out of view, they hesitated longer as his footsteps moved toward the building they had recently snuck around. A door opened and closed, slamming, and muffled voices bounced off the window into the alley. They did not linger and quickly moved to the wall of the next building, skulking around the corner and away from the sentries. Across the road was a large horse stable as they passed by a municipal facility for the waterfront. After the stable was another building with a window to a darkened room, and there was a small parking lot and barn which was big enough to extend back to the field they saw in the distance. The big barn smelled like farm animals, and the odors were wafting across the street to them as they passed a tall brick building with fewer windows at eye level, only smaller ones, lower to the ground and barred up with steel. It was attached to another building with 2 levels, and both facilities were more expansive than the sentry towers the boys had snuck through. With so few years accumulated on the planet, even Ted knew this was probably a jailhouse. The lights were all out here, too. There were 3 two-story houses on the right side of the street where the lights were on yet dim in the front windows, and a few on the second level. The street curved past the junction, where there was an enormous brick building on the right side with darkened windows in each of its 3 levels. 4 stone gargoyles were high on the roof, staring off the ledge with bat-like wings hanging by their sides. To the left stood rickety gallows and a long vacant lot on a lawn which led to the stagnant lake's muddy banks. Next, a large brick building with 4 cement pillars sat atop the broad stairs, guarded by railings on either side in the middle. The double doors between the pillars led out onto a balcony overlooking a small yard containing a reflection pool and 2 sets of benches. There was also a golden statue that Ted recognized as resembling the Greek titan Atlas between the pedestrian sidewalk and yard of the unbelievable estate, to which they appropriated the designation of town courthouse. Atlas, whom Ted had studied, the god of astronomy and arch-nemesis of Zeus or Jupiter, had 2 telescopes attached to his hands, which stretched upward at angles. At the tip of the telescope in his right arm was a round object held upright with multiple triangles along the bottom hemisphere, creating a jagged surface. The other telescope had the same orb but identical triangles protruding off its top like a crown. On his shoulder blades balanced a magnificent satellite object, round and concave. There were possibly hundreds of inhabitants of this area in the housing, but this spot was left open like a park. At the edge of the vacant lot, Alex started to jog. Keeping up was not easy, but Ted did not let it upset him. They veered left at the intersection and sprinted down the street past a closed grocery store on the left, while the sound of their feet made echoes along the block with each step. In the center of the meeting area was a short garage. It looked like an automobile shop. On the right were a few more shops with giant front windows. On the left began a row of houses, and the boys kept jogging until they passed at least 10 dwellings, each quiet but visibly inhabited. Many homes had modern cars out front, on the side of the street or in driveways with garages. Most residencies were well lit inside, but everything was hushed. The next intersection was a perpendicular road which crossed the ongoing street and continued both sides to be residential. They turned left where the road ran parallel to the lake for the following 3 blocks, and an iron guardrail began rising along the shoreside shoulder. Over the rail, they stayed out of lights as much as possible in the eerie nightfall. On the next block, they saw more closed shops and finally an open, well-lit restaurant with a sales sauce sign. Alex stopped jogging and ducked behind the guardrail. "We should go in there. We should see if we can find help or find out where we are." The urge to find food and something to drink anywhere that offered haven from the craziness they had run from was almost impossible to resist for Ted. It took Ted's focus in a first-hand rationale and survival instincts, which Alex had lacked in the brave yet undisciplined insistence of his ability to protect Ted against criminals, to believe caution was their utmost resource. Although he agreed with a nod, Ted hopped up the rail first and sprinted across the road before Alex could go directly to the restaurant. This misdirection caused Alex's cue to be falsely miscommunicated and allowed Ted to avert him from running head-on into the restaurant without taking a closer look. When Ted reached the other side of the road to the restaurant's right, as the shadows fell from the dining area, where there were several tables filled with older men and women, he took refuge. Here, where the shades of obstructive shapes lay motionless in forms that moved under the lights inside, made their theatric dance shadowed in the lawn between, Ted attended his strategy. As darkness's strong puppetry dramatized in silhouette against the looming walls and the canvas of night floated over the sidewalks, he clung like a snail to the side of the shop wall and watched Alex approach.